Before we begin today's video, just letting you all know, I am really sick right now and I lost my voice yesterday, so hopefully this recording will go on without a hitch, but if my voice sounds weird, that's what's doing it. Yeah, enjoy the video to the best of your abilities. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was a bit of a game changer in the 20th century, and sort of a demarcator of a shift in global power away from Europe and into the hands of the United States and the Soviet Union. The crisis centered on the Suez Canal, which is still today a vital artery for global trade, particularly for Western Europe's oil supplies and Britain's access to its former eastern colonies. Opened in 1869, the Suez Canal, constructed under French supervision, revolutionized global trade by connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, slashing 5,000 miles off the maritime route from Europe to Asia, which previously went all the way around South Africa. The Suez Canal Company, a private entity with French, Austrian, Russian, and Egyptian shareholders, managed the canal. In 1875, Egyptian Viceroy Ismail Pasha sold his 44% stake to Britain to alleviate his debts, allowing Britain to sneak in there too. By the 20th century, 80% of the canal's traffic was British, and Egypt had been pretty much a pseudo-British colony for about 20 years, sometimes a protectorate, sometimes under direct colonial rule, depending on what was happening in the world. Regardless, the canal quickly became a cornerstone of Britain's imperial strategy, and it would evolve into the jugular vein of the British Empire. The post-World War II era, however, saw the rapid decline of those European colonial empires. Britain had to grant independence to its colonies, with India, Pakistan, and Burma gaining independence by 1947. Egypt had already achieved nominal independence all the way back in 1922, but Britain still basically controlled the country, and more directly, the British physically controlled the Suez Canal, with a military presence in the Suez Canal zone under a 1936 treaty with the Egyptian monarchy, allowing British troops to remain until 1956. But the Egyptians were quickly becoming unhappy with the king, especially after Egypt's defeat in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Thus, in 1952, the Free Officers Movement, led by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrew the King of Egypt in a bloodless coup, establishing the Egyptian Republic in 1953. Nasser, who was, like many at this time, an Arab nationalist, wanted to modernize Egypt and free it from foreign influence, including that of the Israelis and the British. He, of course, had other ambitions, including building the Aswan Dam to boost Egypt's economy through hydroelectric power and irrigation, but his primary cause was Arab nationalism. Now, initially, Britain and the United States offered to fund Nasser's dam to court Egypt as an ally in the Cold War, because Egypt was the largest Arab state and strategically very important. But Nasser quickly found the Americans disagreeable when they hesitated to provide arms to Egypt due to U.S. domestic support for Israel and fears that those weapons could be used against it. Frustrated, Nasser in 1955 secured a major arms deal with Czechoslovakia, which was a Soviet satellite. Further, Nasser recognized Communist China in 1956, and that caused Britain and the United States to cut the funding. In response, on July 26th, Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company, a legal move to fund the Aswan Dam with revenues from the canal and to boot the Europeans out of Egypt for good. He promised fair compensation to the would-be former shareholders, but Britain saw this as a serious threat. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden compared Nasser to Hitler and Mussolini and called for his removal. With Nasser's support for Algerian rebels who were fighting France, the French also joined the British plan to overthrow him. Israel, under Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, also joined the plot in order to weaken Egypt and end the Tehran blockade, and also just plainly to counter Arab nationalism, which was a threat to their occupation of the Middle East. In October 1956, at a secret meeting in France, the three nations devised a scheme of attack. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula, providing a pretext for Britain and France to intervene as peacemakers to secure the canal. Britain and France would issue an ultimatum demanding both sides withdraw from the canal, and, knowing Egypt would refuse, they would invade to protect the waterway. On October 29th, Israel launched its invasion, capturing the Mitla Pass in Sinai, and the following day, Britain and France issued their ultimatum, demanding a ceasefire and withdrawal of forces 10 miles from the canal. Israel complied, and of course, Egypt refused. On October 31st, British and French air forces operating from Cyprus, Malta, and Mediterranean aircraft carriers began bombarding Egyptian airfields, destroying much of Egypt's air force. On November 5th, British and French paratroopers landed at Port Said and Port Fouad, followed by ground forces on November 6th. The operation was militarily successful, with 26 Anglo-French losses compared to approximately 600 Egyptian soldiers and up to 1,000 civilian casualties. However, Egypt sank merchant ships in the canal, blocking it and rendering it unusable for months. But in an interesting turn of events, even though the Soviet Union was ostensibly aligned with Nasser's Egypt, both the Soviets and the United States condemned the invasion. President Eisenhower was furious at being sidelined, as he wanted to build up American credibility in the Arab world, and politically wanted global focus to be on the Soviet crackdown in Hungary, not what amounted to colonial operations in Egypt. America stayed angry at Britain and France even as the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev threatened rocket attacks on London and Paris, though this was likely bluster. The rare US-Soviet alignment continued even at the United Nations, where both supported resolutions condemning the invasion. By December, UN peacekeeping forces entered the region, and in Britain, public and parliamentary opposition grew against Prime Minister Eden, with figures like Anthony Nutting resigning in protest. Harold Macmillan, the new British Prime Minister, immediately caved to the United States, forging the special relationship between Britain and America, while France, disillusioned with what it now perceived to be British weakness, pursued European integration and, of course, their independent nuclear program. And the Eisenhower Doctrine, which began in 1957, set American foreign policy in the Middle East explicitly to counter Soviet influence, not to support British or French or European interests. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Suez Crisis escalated to World War III? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your Legion like our current channel members, Eaglefall, Derek Arno, Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Roanoke, Subper, Stratocrat, Daniel Andrulis, Alfonso Maurice, Sebastian, Atomical Mon Studios 2, PJ the Homeless Mage, Kennedy the V, Joseph, Chance Bowman, and Justin Ambra. Thank you, and enjoy the video. Speaking of game-changing innovations like the Suez Canal or the apocalyptic consequences of events like the Suez Crisis if they went wrong, I want to take a moment to talk about today's sponsor, the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. This incredible hardcover encyclopedia is like a library of Alexandria of human ingenuity, covering over 400 pages of the most groundbreaking inventions and discoveries in history. From engineering marvels like irrigation canals or roads or bridges to the technologies that shaped empires. As someone fascinated by how history and innovation intertwine, being myself both a civil engineer and an amateur historian, I was blown away by the unique hand-drawn illustrations like this one of the production of asphalt, something I'm intimately familiar with from hours studying the process. These illustrations are just plain fun to look at, crafted by talented artists over the course of 5,000 hours. And the way it breaks down 180 topics over 23 chapters is just fascinating. It's not just a history book, though. It's a guide to rediscovering fire, engineering, and medicine, making it a lifeline for survivors of a nuclear conflict or apocalyptic event like the one we may or may not be discussing in today's video to glue society back together. Whether you're a collector, a parent, a doomsday prepper, or just love diving into the wonders of human progress and ingenuity, this bestseller from 2023 is the perfect gift or addition to your or a friend's or a family member's bookshelf. you can use my personal promo code MrZ10 for 10% off your purchase using the link in the description and pinned comment, or the QR code on screen. Again, that's 10% off the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, when you use the promo code MRZ10 in the description and pinned comment, or follow the QR code on screen. Thank you so much to Hungry Minds for their generous sponsorship, and now let's talk about the end of the world. So in our alternate timeline, we'll assume that perhaps President Eisenhower, instead of opposing the British, French, and Israeli invasion of Egypt, reluctantly supports it due to perhaps lobbying from pro-Israel groups and anti-communist talks in Congress. And with the presidential election looming, Eisenhower, not wanting to appear weak on communism, yields to these pressures. This puts the Americans on the side of the British, the French, and the Israelis instead of opposition to the occupation as they were in our own history. The plan would go as it had in our own history, with Israel occupying Sinai, the British and the French landing in Egypt and securing the Canal Zone, and then the Egyptians sinking ships to block the canal. But with the Americans supporting the war, Khrushchev, when making his threats to Britain and France, would now be under serious pressure to ramp up Soviet involvement. On November 7th, Soviet bombers from Odessa would conduct conventional airstrikes on Anglo-French positions in the Canal Zone, avoiding nuclear weapons initially to test the West. Soviet paratroopers would land in Egypt to support Nasser, escalating the Suez Crisis into yet another Cold War proxy conflict. The United States would put its European forces on high alert and deploy additional naval assets to the Mediterranean. It's likely that NATO would send troops to reinforce West Germany, with the possibility of NATO Article 5 being invoked really at any moment. The British might try to use Malta to bomb the Soviets in Odessa, though we can expect the Americans to prevent this. However, once Khrushchev threatens to bomb London and Paris, President Eisenhower would be forced to accept that all cards were on the table. Britain would call in airstrikes on Soviet airfields, and Khrushchev would have no choice. Under pressure from Stalinists within the Soviet leadership, most notably Molotov, Khrushchev would face a crisis of credibility, and on December 10th, Soviet forces, supported by Warsaw Pact troops, would cross into West Germany through the Fulda Gap, claiming to counter NATO imperialist aggression. West Berlin would immediately fall to Soviet forces, triggering a NATO declaration of war as West Germany joined NATO earlier that year, and Soviet T-55 tanks and motorized divisions would attack the US 7th Army and West German Bundeswehr. The first consequences would come from the air. NATO F-86 Sabres and Hawker Hunters would engage Soviet MiG-15s and MiG-17s, establishing perhaps air superiority. Then conventional bombers would attack Warsaw, Magdeburg, Dresden, East Berlin, Kaliningrad, Odessa, Sevastopol, Murmansk, Poznan, Lodz, Prague, and Damascus. Airstrikes would hit back at Copenhagen, Oslo, Frankfurt, Kassel, Marseille, Toulon, Manchester, Portsmouth, Port Said, Port Fouad, and Ismailia, and bombers would attack Cyprus, Malta, and Tel Aviv. These second consequences would ripple across the world. China would take the opportunity to invade South Korea with North Korean support. Japan would face Chinese naval incursions. Syria and Iraq would launch attacks on Israel. The world would be at war. The third consequences would come from bunkers in America and Russia. As Soviet forces advance in Europe, NATO would authorize tactical nuclear weapons to halt the Soviet advance in Germany. On January 15, 1957, US B-47 bombers would deploy low-yield nuclear warheads against Soviet troop concentrations in the Fulda Gap. In retaliation, the Soviet Union, who suffered from limited intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities, would use medium-range ballistic missiles to strike Paris, Munich, and Manchester with nuclear warheads. London would be spared a direct nuclear hit, but suffer massive fires from conventional rocket attacks. Eisenhower, following National Security Council Directive NSC 162-2, would order a massive nuclear response. US B-52 bombers would target Soviet cities and military sites. The bombs would be dropped on Moscow, Leningrad, Baikonur Cosmodrome, Odessa, Sevastopol, and other cities, with over 200 nuclear detonations in total. The Soviet Union would retaliate with 23 nuclear strikes on US cities, including Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Boston, and various military bases, and the world would fall into nuclear war. A second round of US nuclear strikes would target Chinese cities like Beijing and Shanghai, with Pyongyang in North Korea completely leveled, and Soviet industrial centers like Stalingrad, Chelyabinsk, and Novosibirsk destroyed by Strata fortresses and early Atlas ICBMs. The Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc would collapse. Egypt would descend into anarchy, Western Europe would face a humanitarian catastrophe unlike anything seen before, and even without the sheer world-ending power of the nuclear stockpiles of America and the Soviets in the late Cold War, this early Cold War nuclear exchange would be enough to trigger a nuclear winter, which would lead to mass starvation, death, and essentially the end of the world as we knew it. An apocalyptic nightmare that could go any way, with maybe the old world structures and governments and countries surviving, but much of the planet in either anarchy or loosely enforced martial law. Now that would be a pretty depressing and abrupt note to end on, so perhaps we ought to amend our hypothetical a little bit and ask, what if the Suez Crisis escalated to a conventional World War III? That is, ruling out the use of nuclear weapons on either side, so nuclear war doesn't end the world, but not necessarily the fear of their use from both parties. We'll maintain the same general assumption in this new hypothetical that Eisenhower supports the British, the French, and the Israeli invasion of Egypt due to domestic political pressures, with the invasion proceeding as in reality, but instead of Khrushchev threatening to bomb Paris and London, he strikes the Anglo-French positions in Egypt with bombers and sends paratrooper reinforcements to aid Nasser and mobilizes Warsaw Pact troops in Europe. We'll see again similar events with the US naval presence increasing in the Mediterranean, NATO on high alert, and British retaliatory airstrikes, and this would essentially position everyone in the Warsaw Pact and NATO sphere for a war with one another. Now, NATO and Warsaw Pact forces were roughly balanced in Europe, with the Soviets holding a numerical advantage in tanks and troops, but NATO's air and naval superiority and technological superiority thanks to US carrier groups maintaining what NATO believed to be the security of victory in the event of a prolonged conflict. However, NATO's strategy would dictate essentially that should the Soviets attack Germany, initially the Warsaw Pact would have the upper hand. And that's exactly what we'll assume Khrushchev does for the sake of the scenario. Soviet forces would invade West Germany through the Fulda Gap near Frankfurt and Kassel, triggering NATO Article 5, and the United States would now, for the first time in the Cold War, be directly at war with the Soviet Union, in a declared and undeniable war. Soviet artillery would target Ramstein Air Base, while West Berlin would fall to the Soviet Second Guards Tank Army. NATO's garrison would surrender, and then Soviet bombers would hit Tempelhof Airfield and West German cities as NATO scrambles to respond. NATO would begin airstrikes not long after from bases in the UK, France, and Italy, using F-86 Sabre and F-84 Thunderjet fighters to target Soviet supply lines in East Germany and Poland, followed by Soviet airstrikes and Soviet submarines sinking British destroyers off the coast of Crete. The Royal Navy would sink a Soviet cruiser in the Black Sea, and NATO would disrupt shipping in the Baltic, with the conflict escalating into the Atlantic, where Soviet submarines would begin harassing NATO convoys. Once forces arrived from the continental United States by early 1957, a counteroffensive would be launched in West Germany. The US 3rd and 7th Armies, equipped with M48 Patton tanks, would engage Soviet forces in the Rhine Valley. Heavy fighting around Frankfurt would cause thousands of casualties on both sides, with NATO halting the Soviet advance, but failing to reclaim German territory. The war would be an evolution from the trench warfare of World War I and the blitzkrieg of World War II. Here, modern warfare would be faster, technologically accelerated, and long distance, with air battles taking precedence over lines on the ground, and strikes being launched from halfway across the continent. Guided missiles, anti-aircraft systems, and modern radar would prove to be the most valuable assets in this new war of restraint. Of course, both sides would still believe the other had the capacity to use their nuclear weapons, even though our hypothetical dictates that they won't, and this means the engagements will likely be shorter, smaller, and by necessity more decisive. In the Middle East, Anglo-French forces could secure the Suez Canal zone and fight Egyptian and Soviet forces back a little bit. The canal would be of no use, of course, having been blocked by sunken ships, which would have the nasty side effect of utterly crippling global trade and causing oil shortages in Western Europe. The United Nations, of course, would be unable to do anything, which is actually more interesting than you might first assume, but we'll get to that later. We'll also likely see Syria and Iraq align with the Soviet Union, providing bases for Soviet aircraft. Saudi Arabia and Jordan would quietly support the Americans, with the Saudis perhaps allowing limited basing rights to only the United States, though they would be heavily constrained in any support they might give. At any rate, their non-hostility would be good enough for Eisenhower. In Britain, protests against the war would break out, with Clement Attlee's Labour Party likely preparing for a takeover. The Algerian independence movement would also likely be escalated, with the Soviets perhaps sending even more aid to the Algerian Liberation Front than they had in our own history. By this point, NATO would have established naval dominance in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and the North Sea, and would likely be getting there in the Baltic and the Black Sea, though with neutral Sweden and Finland both likely refusing to dock NATO ships for fear of Soviet retaliation, it would be a slower process. This much would be a minor setback, however, as NATO would soon control the skies. The air war would effectively become a war of attrition, with both sides losing hundreds of planes and billions of dollars. Western Europe would face energy rationing, with Britain and France employing austerity measures due to the Suez's closure. Western Europe would have to shift to relying on American oil, as America was relatively insulated from the effects of the Suez's closure due to its abundant domestic oil production. Though, of course, that's not negating the economic effects of the Suez's closure on the United States. America could perhaps offset the difficulties that Western Europe would be facing, as this could signal a green light for Eisenhower to ramp up US oil production or even start to use the reserves and send them to Europe. De Gaulle in France might not like it, as he would see it as yet another point of American influence over Europe, but he had no real choice in the matter. NATO cohesion could be harmed, though. In the Soviet Union, the economic strain from the war would lead to more food shortages and industrial bottlenecks. The more aggressive factions in the Politburo would not be happy with Khrushchev's lack of escalation, especially as the war bogs down into a stalemate with NATO and Warsaw Pact forces entrenching, and thus Khrushchev could face a serious legitimacy crisis. Egypt could perhaps retake parts of Sinai, but by this point the war would be stuck. It's likely then that a ceasefire would be mediated in Geneva or perhaps Stockholm, with the Americans pressuring Britain and France to compromise to end the conflict. The Suez Canal would come under UN administration, with revenues shared among Egypt and the former shareholders. Soviet and NATO forces would withdraw from the contested areas in Europe, establishing a demilitarized zone along the inter-German border. West Berlin would be granted neutral status, with guaranteed access for NATO, and the United Nations would guarantee funding for the Aswan Dam. However, an interesting side effect of all of this would be that the United Nations may actually face a legitimacy crisis. In our own history, the UN peacekeeping mission that halted the Suez Crisis was a landmark success and really established the UN as a credible mediator. With the conflict basically escalating to World War III and the UN likely paralyzed, trust in the organization would erode, especially in the global south, where it would practically be viewed as a superpower pawn. This could lead to the solidification of the non-aligned movement, or the UN simply being reduced to an organization used by the West and the Soviet sphere to resolve conflicts, but one ignored by the rest of the world. The UN's role in the 1958 Geneva Accords might restore some credibility, but its perceived weakness would persist and only grow with time. The war would end essentially with no clear victor. The United States would be even more assuredly the dominant Western power, though this was inevitable already, and France might perhaps accelerate its nuclear program and European integration, but really the only effects of this war that truly change anything would be negative. NATO would be even more dependent on America, the Soviets would be facing widespread starvation, decolonization would accelerate perhaps more violently, oil prices would be sky high, and none of the instability of the Middle East would be decidedly solved. Israel would still feel threatened on all sides and seek to expand and destroy its neighbors, while the United Arab Republic might expand into Syria and Yemen, and this would likely set the stage for an even more intense version of the Six-Day War. And that's where I'll be leaving this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.